Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to week 3. So let's sort of lay out what we're going to be doing over the next 3 weeks, including this week. So we're going to be looking at informal fallacies, and there are quite a few of them. And so what we'll do is take them out in chunks. I'm going to divide them across 3 different weeks. It would be too overwhelming for you to try to handle all 20 or so informal fallacies at one time, so divide and conquer here. So this week we're going to be concerned with what are called fallacies of relevance. But let's start by just understanding generally what fallacies are and a fundamental distinction between formal fallacies and informal fallacies. Okay, so generally a fallacy is a defect in an argument. They're usually either the products of a mistake, so someone's made a logical error, mistaken reasoning, or they're doing it intentionally and they're creating an illusion to get you to accept some conclusion. So fallacies could be accidental, or they could be intentional, and I'll give examples of the kind of context where they might be accidental or they might be intentional here as we go along. Okay, so first let's understand what formal fallacies are. Now, formal fallacies, they can be identified by merely examining the form or structure of an argument. So here's a simple categorical syllogism. We talked about those previously. So all A's are B's, all C's are B's, therefore all A's are C's. Now, later on we'll learn the rules for determining whether these types of arguments commit formal fallacies. We haven't done that yet. That'll be later in the semester. But I know those rules, and I can look at the way the terms are arranged in this argument, terms being A, B, and C, and I can know that the structure or the pattern of the argument is an invalid argument form. So I don't have to even know what A, B, and C actually represent. I could plug all kinds of things in there, like all dogs are mammals, all chickens are mammals, right, and so on. So in order to identify a formal fallacy, you don't have to understand the actual meanings of the terms in the argument. You just have to be able to understand what patterns are acceptable and which ones aren't, or in this case it's a deductive argument, so which patterns are valid or invalid. So formal fallacies, remember, are about the structure or the form alone. Now, informal fallacies, they can be detected only by examining the content of the argument. And when I say content, that means by understanding the meanings of the terms in the arguments and how they relate to one another, how the terms relate to one another in the argument. So here's an example. All factories are plants. All plants are things that contain chlorophyll. Therefore, all factories contain chlorophyll. Now, if we looked at this argument just from a structural viewpoint, it would look like it's all A's are B's, all B's are C's, therefore all A's are C's. But closer inspection, there's something weird going on. And that's where we have to employ this idea of understanding the content of the argument. So in the first premise, we say all factories are plants. In the second premise, we say all plants are things that contain chlorophyll. But clearly what's going on here is we're using the word plants in 2 different ways. In the first premise, the word plants refers to a kind of place where you would manufacture something. On the other hand, in the second premise, we're talking about these green things that use sunlight and water to produce carbohydrates. So living things in this case. So what philosophers call this is the fallacy of equivocation, and we'll learn that later on. We're not going to learn it in this section, that's later on. But the word equivocation just means to use a word in two different ways. So in the first premise, we're using the term plant to refer to one kind of thing in the world, a place where you manufacture something. And in the second premise, we're using the word plant to refer to these living organisms that produce carbohydrates through photosynthesis. So for an argument to be acceptable, you can't change the meaning of the terms throughout the argument. The terms have to stay consistent in their meaning, and so this argument would fail as a result of changing the meaning of the terms. So you could only know this argument was fallacious, that it had a defect, if you understand the meaning of plants and the possibility that plants could have two different types of meaning and that it's referring to two different objects throughout the argument. So you have to understand the content of the argument to recognize that the fallacy is occurring. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about informal fallacies. You have to understand the meanings of the terms and their relationship to detect the logical error. Okay, so our first group of fallacies, they're called fallacies of relevance, and they all commit essentially the same error in general, but they do it in different ways. So what's going on with fallacies of relevance is the conclusion seems to follow psychologically from the premises. It just seems to make sense to us from a psychological perspective, seems satisfying and compelling, in other words, to us mentally. But it does not follow logically. In other words, we're sort of tricked by our psychology into accepting that the conclusion actually follows from the premises that are being presented, when in fact it does not follow logically. So each one of these fallacies we're going to look at coming up here commit that same logical error. They just do it in different ways. Now, the goal here is to go through these fallacies, understand their basic structure, and I'll give you some examples here of each type. And then on the exams later on the quizzes, you'll have to be able to read a passage and identify which of these fallacies is actually being committed. That's the goal, to be able to detect these fallacies in everyday speech. Okay, so our first fallacy of relevance is called appeal to force. That's the name of the fallacy, appeal to force. And it always involves a threat by the arguer to the physical or psychological well-being of the listener or reader, whether an individual or a group of people. So this one's pretty simple to detect, and you've come across this fallacy many times in everyday life. One individual is trying to convince another individual to accept some sort of conclusion, and instead of offering logical evidence to support that conclusion and trying to inferentially or logically convince the individual to accept it, they threaten the individual in some way to try to compel them to accept it. So you could imagine a student comes to me and says, look, Mr. Rowe, I really need an A, so that's the conclusion they want me to try to accept, that they really deserve an A. And then the student says, and so if you don't give me the A that I want, then I'm going to key your car or kill your pet or something like that. So that individual, the student, is not actually giving me an argument for why they deserve a higher grade. They're simply threatening my physical well-being and trying to compel me to accept their conclusion. Now, that could be psychologically irrelevant to me, obviously. I don't want my car to be keyed or my pet to be injured. But nevertheless, it's not logically relevant. There isn't any evidence actually being offered in favor of the conclusion that the student deserves a better grade. So appeal to force is pretty easy to detect. If you see either an implicit or an explicit threat involved in an exchange in one of the passages you're reading when you're detecting fallacies, then you're probably dealing with the fallacy of appeal to force. Then we have appeal to pity. This is our second fallacy of relevance. So in this case, the arguer attempts to support a conclusion by evoking pity from the reader or listener, whether directed toward the arguer or towards some third party. So what's going on here is person A wants you to accept a conclusion, and so to try to get you to accept the conclusion, they try to get you to feel a particular way about something related to the conclusion. So they try to elicit emotions or certain feelings. There are lots of examples of appeal to pity. It's one of the most common fallacies out there in everyday discourse. A good example I know is once when I was serving jury duty, it was civil court, and this individual had suffered a car wreck, and he was suing the person that had run into him. And so the attorney for the person that had been hit by the other car, and the person that was in the car wreck, he listed a long series of terrible things that the person had gone through. He said, look, not only has Mr. Thompson experienced this car wreck, his wife has cancer, and the car wreck made it difficult for him to think about all the things she needed for her cancer treatment. He wasn't able to go to work, and so his employer was unhappy with him, and so on and so on. So they listed all these different bad things that had happened to the person that was hit by the other car. And so then, as a result of all of that, the attorney said, look, I want you to award $50,000 to Mr. Thompson. So what was going on there is an appeal to pity. Mr. Thompson may deserve some award from the jury for the car wreck, compensation for car damage, compensation for medical costs as a result of the car wreck. But the fact that his wife has cancer is not causally related to what happened in the car wreck. It's sad that that's the case. It's unfortunate that his wife is dealing with cancer, but it has no bearing on the responsibility of the other party who is being asked to pay a certain quantity of money for the accident. So what the attorney is trying to do is make the jury feel bad for the individual, and by making them feel a particular way, maybe they accept the conclusion. So appeal to pity is pretty easy to spot in everyday life and in everyday discourse. Anytime somebody is trying to elicit emotions or evoke a certain emotion from you to get you to accept something, that's likely going to be appeal to pity. And we have appeal to the people, direct versus indirect. So appeal to the people is the overall fallacy, and it has sort of subtypes. And we'll see another fallacy after this one that has some subtypes to it too. So I'd like you to be able to distinguish between the different subtypes. So overall, as I said, the general name for the fallacy is appeal to the people, but we have to go through the direct version versus the indirect version. Okay, so the general idea here is that the arguer uses the reader or listener's desire for love, esteem, admiration, value, and similar emotions to get the reader or listener to accept a conclusion. So instead of offering an actual argument with evidence in favor of the particular conclusion, they're trying to get the person they're trying to convince of the conclusion to feel a particular way based on their need for love or self-esteem or admiration, value, and so on. Okay, so then there's the direct approach. This is the one version of the appeal to the people fallacy. So the direct approach, it occurs when an arguer is addressing a large group of people and excites the emotions, enthusiasms of the crowd or that group of people. So think of political speeches. Political speeches are almost always guilty of the fallacy of appeal to the people. Rarely are logical arguments offered in political speeches. They'll just say things like the other party sucks, or we need to lock them all up, or we're better than everyone, they're all immoral, right? But no argument's actually being made in any of those claims. It's simply an attempt to rile the crowd up, excite them with emotion and enthusiasm, and get them to accept the view that I'm the candidate that should be the best contender here for our party's bid for this political position. So in the direct approach, you need to think of it in the context of a large group of people being influenced by one individual and trying to get them to accept a conclusion based on trying to excite them, evoke emotions or elicit emotions, and elicit enthusiasm. Now in the indirect approach, what the arguer does is, instead of focusing on a large crowd, they focus on one particular individual. So the arguer aims his or her appeal at one or more individuals in the crowd, focusing on some aspect of the relationship to the crowd. So the indirect approach for the appeal to people occurs a lot in advertising. I saw a Mercedes commercial not too long ago, Mercedes-Benz commercial, the car, and it showed a beautiful woman in a really expensive house, and she's dressed in a high society kind of way, and she goes out and gets in the car and goes for a drive on the California coast somewhere, beautiful scenery and so on. And so at the end of the commercial, it says something like, only the elite few experience Mercedes-Benz, or something like that. So what's going on there is they're trying to convince you that you should buy a Mercedes-Benz because of individuals' desire to be like the person in the commercial. Oftentimes people want to have wealth, they want to have extravagance, they want to look beautiful, they want to live in beautiful places on the planet, and so by involving all of those emotions in the commercial, it makes the car seem appealing. But nowhere in the commercial do they actually make an argument for why you should buy the car. Simply it's an attempt to elicit certain emotions from you in the commercial. Now, if they would have said, you should buy a Mercedes-Benz because it gets this kind of mileage, or it's this reliable, or it's this safe in crashes, or something like that, then they would be offering evidence in favor of a particular conclusion, perhaps compelling evidence in that case. But in that commercial, they don't do that. They just simply show a beautiful person driving around in a beautiful place. So that's an example of the indirect approach as opposed to the direct approach. Another example of indirect, just to make sure we understand the difference here, because the direct approach is pretty easy to spot. It's a large group of people being addressed by one individual. So another example of the indirect approach would be the Marine Corps advertising motto, the few, the proud, the Marines. That's a motto they've used for a long time in their advertising campaigns. So what's going on there is, what they're trying to say is that if you're a Marine, you're elite, you're different, you're not like the rest of society. So they're trying to make the Marines look more appealing because it shows that you are a special kind of individual that has properties above and beyond what average people have. They don't make the case for why you should join the Marines, like pay for college or learn certain job skills and so on. They're just trying to appeal to your emotion about being an elite individual. Okay, so that's appeal to the people, direct versus indirect. Okay, so we have another one here that has some subgroupings. Argument against the person. So there'll be three here. So we'll go through these individually. I want you to be able to distinguish between the three subgroupings here. So the overall name of the fallacy is argument against the person. Now, sometimes the old Latin is used. Back in the Middle Ages, logicians and philosophers attached Latin names to all of these fallacies, and so some of them have still hung around. So ad hominem just means to the man or against the man, and so that's just a different way of referring to argument against the person. Same fallacy, just a different name. One's in Latin and one's not. So in the ad hominem abusive, this is the simplest version of argument against a person. So in the ad hominem abusive fallacy, the second person responds to the first person's argument by verbally abusing the first person. So what you've had is somebody offers an argument, and then the other person, their job is to critique that argument, and instead of critiquing the logical structure of the argument that's been offered, they attack the person who's offering the argument. Now, this is another example we see really often in politics. Politicians rarely critique their opponent's actual positions. They want to generally attack the person that's offering the particular position. So, there's a good example that I remember. I'm old enough to remember when Bill Clinton was elected president. And so the first time that Bill Clinton was running for the presidency, he admitted that he'd smoked marijuana when he was at Oxford University. And so that's not such a big deal these days with politicians, but it was a really big deal back in the 1980s. And so very shortly after his admission that he'd smoked marijuana, his opponents started publicly saying things like, well, how could we ever trust Bill Clinton to give us an adequate drug control policy? He was a drug user when he was at Oxford University. So what's going on there is clearly an ad hominem abusive. They're not attacking Bill Clinton's drug control policy. They're attacking Bill Clinton himself for smoking marijuana. And so in logic, we are only concerned with evaluating the argument itself. We don't care who's offered the argument. We don't care what their experiences are. We don't care what their background is. None of that stuff matters. All we care about in logic is the actual evidence that's being offered in favor of the conclusion. So in this case, Bill Clinton is attacked personally, but his argument isn't actually evaluated at all. Now there's another version, the ad hominem circumstantial, which is similar but clearly different. So in this case, the respondent attempts to discredit the opponent's argument by alluding to the opponent's circumstances. So their surrounding life circumstances or the events in their life and so on. The respondent hopes to show that the opponent is predisposed to argue the way he or she does and should therefore not be taken seriously. So a good example I've seen in the past in the media that was an ad hominem circumstantial, Bill Gates, the founder of Microsoft, he's given a lot of money to education for the development of technology for educational purposes and so on. I've seen people criticize Bill Gates. Bill Gates has publicly said, I think that technology is important for the advancement of education. So people have criticized him by saying, look, we can't accept Bill Gates' arguments for the importance of technology in education because he owns a technology company and he stands to gain millions of dollars of profit if his platforms are used in an educational context. So what's going on there is they're not attacking Bill Gates' claim that technology is important for education. What they're doing is attacking the fact that Bill Gates owns a company that produces technology that could be used for educational purposes. So just because of the circumstances of Bill Gates owning that company, he's being attacked. Now maybe he does have ulterior motives. It's possible that he wants to make money. But it's also possible that his argument that technology is important for the improvement of education is a compelling argument also. You could look at the data and see if, say, schools that have added technology have improved scores and so on. So in logic, once again, we're only concerned with logically related claims. Just because of particular surrounding circumstantial events and so on, that's not enough to actually undermine a particular conclusion. We would have to look at the evidence in favor of the particular conclusion itself. And then our third version of argument against the person is called the tu quoque fallacy, or the U2 fallacy. That's what it's usually called in the non-Latin way. So the U2 fallacy, in this case, the second arguer attempts to make the first appear to be hypocritical, arguing in bad faith. So once again, it's a version of our previous examples. You're arguing against the person, but in this case, you're trying to show that the person that you're arguing against is guilty of exactly the thing that they are arguing against, or are stating their argument for. So, for example, I saw this talk show one time where it was mothers and daughters, and they were, these daughters had been irresponsible socially. They hadn't been going to school. Some of them had been arrested. Some had been in trouble with illicit drugs and so on. And so the mothers were on this show with the daughters, trying to convince the daughters that they shouldn't behave that way. And the mothers made compelling arguments. They said things like, if you don't go to school, then you won't become educated, and then you won't go to college, and you won't qualify for well-paying jobs, and that could affect life in the long run. And if you get arrested, then obviously you have to deal with being incarcerated, and you have a criminal record and so forth. So the mothers are making compelling arguments for why the daughters shouldn't behave the way they were. And how did the daughters respond? They didn't respond by attacking the mother's arguments about criminal records or the need for an education in order to have high income later in life. What they did was attacked the mother's own personal actions. They said, you can't tell us not to behave this way because you did it when you were a teenager also. So in that case, it fits the fallacy perfectly. They are accusing the mothers of doing exactly what the mothers are trying to convince them not to do. Now, the mothers may seem hypocritical because the mothers actually did what they're trying to convince their daughters not to do. But logically, the mothers have compelling arguments because they're offering arguments in favor of why the daughters ought to behave that way, or ought not to behave that way. So the tu quoque fallacy, or the U2 fallacy, is pretty easy to spot. Basically, anytime somebody says, yeah, but you did it too, they're going to be guilty of tu quoque. So remember, the relationship here has to be one where the arguer is being attacked because of exactly the thing that they are arguing about. They're being attacked for being guilty of exactly that issue, and that's what makes the U2 fallacy. Okay, so then we have the fallacy of accident. This one's pretty easy. This fallacy is committed when a general rule is applied to a specific case it was not intended to cover. So, a general rule in the U.S. Constitution is that adult American citizens have the right to bear arms. So we could take that general rule and say Americans have the right to bear arms. Therefore, that homicidal maniac that's getting out of prison has the right to own an assault rifle, right? So that seems to be a case where somebody's taking a general rule that applies to everyone, the right to bear arms, and then applying it to an individual or the rule where the rule should apply differently because of their past behavior. So if you encounter a passage where there's a general rule being asserted, everyone has the right to bear arms, and then some controversial or sort of crazy inference is drawn from that general rule, then you're almost always dealing with the fallacy of accident. Now we have straw man. So this fallacy is committed when an arguer distorts an opponent's argument for the purpose of attacking it more easily, demolishes the distorted argument, and then concludes that the opponent's real argument has been demolished. So it's called straw man because the idea is that you change the argument that was initially offered by your opponent to a weaker argument, or a straw man, meaning that it's easier to knock down a straw man, or like a scarecrow basically, right, than it is to knock down a living individual. So in this argument, in this fallacy, what has to happen is that the person who's critiquing the original argument, they have to modify the original individual's position. They have to change it to where it's weaker or distorted, and then attack that distorted version. And that's important because we're going to see a fallacy later on called red herring that can be confused pretty easily with straw man, but different things are going on there logically. Straw man, it's an attempt to basically reconstruct the opponent's argument in a weaker form, and then we'll see red herring as something a little different later. So examples of straw man fallacy happen quite often. You see them quite a bit in politics, where one politician might have a position on, let's say, border control. They have some policy they want to implement that involves how we would handle illegal immigrants at the southern border, for example. And so instead of the critic then, instead of actually attacking that individual's position, they construct a position that is crazier or weaker than the individual's actual position, like politician X wants no check at the border, or they have an open border policy. Sometimes you'll see this in the Republican and Democrat discussions about this issue. The Republicans will say the Democrats just want an open border. But generally, most Democrats don't want an open border. They want border control, but with more flexible policies and allowing people to enter the country legally. So, but if the Republicans in this case say Democrats want an open border policy, that's clearly a straw man. They're constructing a distorted, weakened version of the actual position. Then we have missing the point. So this fallacy occurs when the premises of an argument support one particular conclusion, but a different conclusion, often vaguely related to the correct conclusion, is drawn. So missing the point, I mean, technically all fallacies miss the point, but they do it in sort of specific, subtle ways, and that's why we have all these distinctions. But missing the point is reserved for those instances where somebody's arguing a particular way and you can see where the conclusion should go, and then they just jump to some unexpected, improbable conclusion. And that's when you're dealing specifically with missing the point. So for example, somebody might argue that our prison system is failing, it's costly, it doesn't rehabilitate people, it causes a number of social problems, and doesn't produce the desired results, essentially. And so as a result of all of those negative things happening in our criminal justice system, they draw the conclusion that the only solution is to execute all people who are arrested, or all people who are convicted of serious crimes. Now that's a pretty big jump to go from, there's some problems in our criminal justice and our prison system and so on, to the conclusion that all people should that are involved in that system and guilty of a particular crime ought to be executed. The real conclusion ought to be to make certain changes within the criminal justice system and the prison system to rectify whatever the particular problems are, not to just say let's execute people and not have a prison system at all. So that'd be a good example of missing the point. We're going from fairly reasonable argument to sort of a crazy position in the end. So when you're looking for missing the point, you want to sort of think that, is this a big jump from where I thought this argument was going to where it actually ended up? And if it's a big jump, it's likely going to be missing the point. And so then finally we have red herring. This fallacy is committed when the arguer diverts the attention of the reader or listener by changing the subject to a different but sometimes subtly related one. either a conclusion is then drawn about the different issue, or it's simply presumed that a conclusion has been established. So, like I said earlier, this red herring can look a lot like straw man fallacy, but something different is actually going on here. In red herring, the critic of the argument is not actually distorting the argument that's been offered. They are just going off on a completely different argument line that might be related to the previous position, but it's not on track with what the original arguer was trying to argue. So, for example, someone might argue that environmentalists have been complaining about the negative effects of nuclear power for many, many decades. And then, as a critique of that argument, the critic might say, but look, no matter how you generate electricity, there's going to be some deaths. People die from electrocution every day. It's almost impossible to keep people from making mistakes when wiring houses or plugging in different items in their home and so on. So what happened there is we went from talking about the negative effects of nuclear power, which environmentalists mean environmentally negative effects, like nuclear waste and impact on waterways, water being heated up when it's used as a cooling source for nuclear power and so on, to talking about the dangers of electricity. And so that's not what environmentalists are talking about when they're talking about the negative impact of nuclear power. They're talking about those environmental impacts. So, nuclear power plants generate electricity, so that's subtly related, but that's not actually the issue. So that's a red herring fallacy, clearly. So we start off talking about the environmental impact of nuclear power, and then the argument shifts to a discussion about the dangers of electricity. Okay, so those are our fallacies in the first grouping, ending with red herring here. We'll do these in chunks. These can be quite challenging, and so I think this is the best way to approach it. Take a look at the practice quizzes. I've put 2 in there for Chapter 3 because I think it's best that you get exposed to a number of these examples. But remember, when you do take the actual graded quiz, every single argument that's offered will commit some kind of fallacy in this category of fallacies of relevance. Okay. If you have any concerns or questions, don't hesitate to contact me. See you next week.